The call came through at 6 in the morning, and my coffee was still hot when Colonel Briggs told me I had 40 minutes to get to Fort Haverfield, or the entire diplomatic mission was going to be reassigned to someone who actually answered their phone on the first ring. I answered on the second ring. I told him that. He did not appreciate it. My name is Marcus Reyes, and I have spent 11 years in the United States Army as a combat engineer. I have cleared minefields in places that do not appear on most maps. I have built bridges under fire, and taken apart buildings with nothing but determination and a very good team. I have done things that still wake me up at 3 in the morning, and I have done them without complaint, because that is the job. That has always been the job. You show up, you do the work, you come home if you are lucky, and then you go back and do it again. But nothing in those 11 years, not one single deployment or exercise or briefing or mission, prepared me for what happened when I pulled up to the landing pad at Fort Haverfield and watched a Vethari diplomatic shuttle come down out of the Texas sky like a chrome knife dropping through warm butter. The Vethari were not new to us. Humanity had made first contact with the Galactic Compact 14 months earlier, and in those 14 months we had gone from shock to disbelief to the particular kind of breathless adaptation that humans have always been quietly good at. The Vethari were the military caste of the Compact's most powerful founding species. They were tall, averaging around 7 feet, with lean muscular frames covered in pale blue-gray skin that looked almost like polished stone under direct light. They had 4 eyes arranged in a slight arc across a broad, flat face, and their hearing organs were 2 thin slits, just above where a human jaw would start. They did not smile, not because they were unfriendly, but because the expression did not exist in their biology. Their faces at rest carried a focused stillness that humans tend to read as hostility, but which was simply how they looked when they were paying attention. And the Vethari were always paying attention. They were also, by the Compact's own records, responsible for ending 14 interplanetary conflicts and suppressing 3 full-scale galactic wars in the last 2 centuries alone. The Vethari warrior caste were the most feared soldiers in known space, not because they were the most numerous, not because their technology was the most advanced, because they were extraordinarily good at what they did. And what they did was assess situations with absolute accuracy, and then act on that assessment with total commitment. I was assigned to escort 6 of them for 4 days. The briefing document I had been given described my role as cultural liaison and integration facilitator, which was the government's polished way of saying that nobody else wanted the job, and I had made the mistake of speaking positively about the Compact in a meeting 3 weeks ago. My commanding officer, Colonel Briggs, had a long memory and a very efficient sense of humor. He had looked at me over his coffee mug after that meeting and said nothing at all, which I now understood had been him filing the information away for later use. I showered, pulled on my uniform, and made it to Fort Haverfield in 38 minutes. The 2 minutes to spare felt like a personal victory. When the shuttle door opened and the delegation came down the ramp, I noticed 3 things immediately. First, they moved like water, each step perfectly placed, bodies carrying a kind of controlled readiness that I recognized from years of being around highly trained people, the kind of movement that does not call attention to itself because it does not need to. Second, their equipment was extraordinary even in diplomatic configuration. The uniforms they wore had a faint shimmer that I knew, from the briefing documents, came from lightweight kinetic dispersion weave threaded through the fabric. They wore their protection the way humans wear a cotton shirt. Comfortable, automatic, unremarkable to them. Third, and most importantly, they were staring at the fort with an expression I could not immediately name. I would come to understand that expression over the next 4 days. I would see it many times. It was the expression of people who were looking at something that did not match any existing category in their experience, and were quietly, very carefully, trying to figure out which category to build. The leader of the delegation introduced himself through the translator unit clipped to his collar. His name, rendered into English syllables, came out as something close to Commander Thress. He was the tallest of the group, which put him at roughly 7 feet 2 inches, and he had a scar running from the outer edge of his left eye, set down to his jaw, that had clearly come from something sharp and determined. The scar was old. Whatever had made it had not slowed him down. He stood very straight, and looked at me with the 4-eyed focus that I was going to have to get used to, and I had the clear and specific feeling of being read the way an experienced engineer reads a blueprint. Fast, thorough, nothing missed. Liaison Reyes, he said, through the translator. The translator gave his voice a flat, precise quality, like a very competent person reading instructions aloud. We are prepared to proceed to the designated accommodation facility. Yes, sir, I said, and pointed at the vehicle I had driven to the pad. All 6 of them looked at it. The vehicle in question was a 2019 government-issue Ford Expedition. It was dark blue, slightly dusty from the drive-in, and had a small dent in the rear bumper from when Corporal Davies had backed it into a loading dock 6 months ago. Nobody had gotten around to fixing the dent because it was a minor dent, and nobody could agree on whose budget line it should come out of. The windshield had a small crack in the lower right corner from a rock on the interstate, also unrepaired, also the subject of ongoing bureaucratic disagreement. It was, in other words, a completely normal government vehicle. This is the transport, Commander Thress said. It arrived as a statement, but carried the weight of a question. Yes, sir. There was a pause. The second-ranking member of the delegation, a female officer whose name translated roughly as Yalith, stepped slightly to the side and looked at the vehicle from a different angle. Then she said something to Thress in their own language that the translator did not catch, because she had angled her collar slightly away. Whatever she said, 2 of the other warriors made a quiet sound that I would later learn was the Vethari equivalent of a suppressed laugh. Not a mocking sound, more like the sound of people who have just been told something mildly improbable and are choosing to find it interesting rather than alarming. It has no dampening field, Thress said. No, sir. Standard internal combustion engine. It burns refined petroleum to generate forward motion. Very reliable. It burns material, Yalith said slowly, as if testing whether the translation was accurate. Yes, ma'am. Another pause. They looked at each other. Then, with the careful dignity of people who had not survived 14 interplanetary conflicts by backing down from novel situations, all 6 of them climbed into the Ford Expedition. The seatbelts took 4 minutes. I explained the buckle mechanism 3 times. By the 3rd explanation, Thress had his figured out and was quietly helping the others without being asked, which told me a great deal about who he was as a leader. The kind of officer who does not ask his people to figure out things alone that he has already figured out himself. I pulled out of Fort Haverfield and headed for the highway, and the diplomatic mission was officially underway. For the first 10 minutes, nobody said anything. I watched them in the rearview mirror as much as I could safely manage while driving, which was more than I should have been doing on a county road, but less than I wanted to. They were looking out the windows with those 4-eyed faces turned outward, watching the Texas landscape roll past. The flat brown scrub, the occasional cluster of live oaks, the long straight road cutting through dry ground toward the horizon. The sky was enormous and pale blue above it all, the way the Texas sky is enormous, as if it is making a point. I wondered what they saw. I wondered if everything looked dangerous, the way Earth was supposed to look, to species that had not evolved here. The compact databases, from what I had read in the briefing materials, classified Earth as a death world, Category 7, which was as high as the category system went for inhabited planets. The atmospheric composition, the gravity, the range of native wildlife, the seismic and storm activity, the variety and persistence of biological threats ranging from bacteria to megafauna, all of it together created an environment that most species in the compact would find profoundly inhospitable. The Vethari homeworld was Category 4, which was considered quite intense by compact standards. The fact that Earth was Category 7, and that humans had not only survived but multiplied and built cities and invented the internet, and argued about parking spots was, according to the diplomatic briefing documents, considered unusual. Liaison Reyes, Thress said finally, about 15 minutes into the drive. Yes, sir. How far is the accommodation facility? About an hour and 20 minutes, sir. We are going to my family's property. It was cleared by your embassy staff last week as a suitable overnight location before the summit. A less formal setting, they felt. Your family property, he repeated, and something in the translation came through with a slight flatness, as if the concept was being processed carefully. This is your personal dwelling. My parents' place. Yes, sir. I grew up there. My mother still lives there full-time, and my father visits most weeks. He is there now. It was approved as a secure facility, he said. It is secure enough, I said. We will be comfortable. I did not understand, at the time, What exactly those words meant to a Vethari military officer trying to reconcile the concept of a civilian house with the concept of a secure facility. I was about to find out. We came off the highway 40 minutes later and turned onto the county road that wound through the low country my parents had bought before I was born. The land was dry and flat in the way that South Texas tends to be, with scrub cedar and patches of prickly pear spreading across the rocky ground. A hawk was circling something in the middle distance, patient and unhurried. The road was unpaved for the last quarter mile, and the expedition bumped and rocked over it with the cheerful indifference of a vehicle that had been driven over considerably worse. I pulled through the gate, which my father had left open, and the house came into view. I want to be precise about what the house looked like, because it matters enormously to what happened next. It was a single-story Texas limestone ranch house, built in the early 1970s by a man named Gerald, who had cared more about keeping the weather out than impressing anybody who drove past. The walls were thick, 18 inches of fitted limestone block that my grandfather had helped to lay one summer, when Gerald had run short of labor and money at the same time. The foundation was a deep reinforced concrete slab that went 4 feet down into the ground, because the land flooded sometimes, and you built accordingly if you were a person who intended to be there a long time. The roof had been replaced 12 years ago with standing seam steel, because asphalt shingles do not survive the hailstorms that move through that part of Texas with cheerful regularity, and my father had gotten tired of replacing them. The windows were double pane because heat, and the front door was a solid steel core unit with one deadbolt, a second deadbolt lower on the frame, and a bar lock across the middle that my mother had installed after a coyote had figured out how to push the original door open one night in 2009 and gotten into the kitchen. It was a house, a sturdy, honest, plain house where people had lived and worked and raised children and grown old. It had a front porch with 2 rocking chairs that my father had bought at an estate sale in 1998 and had been meaning to repaint for about 15 years. It had a garden along the south wall, where my mother grew things. It had a satellite dish on the east face of the roof, and a propane tank in a concrete cradle on the north side, and a rusted wind chime hanging from the porch eave that my youngest sister had made in high school, and that nobody had ever had the heart to take down, even though it had not worked properly in a decade. I parked in the gravel drive and turned off the engine. None of the Vethari moved. I looked in the rearview mirror. All 6 of them were looking at the house. Thress had his head slightly tilted, which I had already noticed he did when he was thinking hard about something. Yeleth had leaned forward and was studying the exterior walls with the focused attention of someone who is counting things. The other 4 warriors were very still. Not the stillness of boredom, the stillness of concentration. "This is it," I said. "This is your family's dwelling," Thress said. His voice through the translator had a careful quality to it. "Yes, sir." He looked at the walls. "Limestone construction." "That is right. Local stone. Very common building material in this region." "The wall thickness," Yeleth said, almost to herself. "Liaison Reyes. What is the wall thickness?" "About 18 inches. That is just how they built here in those days. Keeps the house cool in summer." They looked at each other. Thress looked back at the house, and his 4 eyes moved in that slight, independent tracking way that I had read about in the briefing documents, each pair focusing at a slightly different depth and angle, gathering layered information. "How many personnel are typically garrisoned in a structure of this type?" he asked. I blinked. "Garrisoned? How many individuals occupy this installation?" "It is a house," I said, very carefully. "My parents, 2 people." The silence that followed was one of the longest silences I have ever sat in, and I have sat in some significant silences in my life. Commander Thress had led raids on 7 star systems. He had faced down species that could regenerate lost limbs in under a minute. He had stood in the ruins of civilizations and made decisions under pressure that most people could not comprehend. And he had come out the other side still standing, and still sharp, and still in command of himself and his people. He was sitting in my parents' dusty driveway, looking at a Texas limestone ranch house, and he looked like he needed a moment to recalibrate something fundamental. I got out of the car, walked around, and opened the passenger doors. "Welcome to Texas," I said. The first thing Biscuit did was hit the screen door at full speed. The screen door won on the first impact. Barely. It bounced back. Biscuit hit it a second time. The latch gave way, because the latch always gave way, because Biscuit hit the door at the same full speed every single time, and had been doing so for 7 years, and the latch had long since accepted that this was simply its life. 70 pounds of golden retriever came through the doorway with his ears flat, and his tongue already going, and all 4 feet scrambling on the porch boards in that particular way that large dogs have when they are moving faster than their legs have fully agreed to. He came off the porch like he was being launched and hit me squarely in the chest, both front paws up, tail moving so fast it was a blur, attempting to lick my face with a thoroughness and enthusiasm that I found both touching and slightly excessive. Then he noticed the 6 tall blue-gray strangers standing by the car. He dropped off me. He turned. He went into the specific stillness that retrievers do when they have found something that requires their complete attention. Body low and forward, nose working rapidly, tail suspended at half-mast. Everything about him focused on this new and unprecedented information. 3 of the Vethari warriors took a step back. Not a panicked step, a measured step, the kind trained soldiers take when they have assessed a situation and decided that additional space is tactically sensible. Yalith's right hand went to her hip, found nothing where a weapon would normally live, and returned to her side in a single controlled motion. The discipline in that movement was extraordinary. Under any other circumstances, I would have noted it professionally and moved on. As it was, I was watching a highly trained alien military officer exercise remarkable self-control because my dog had looked at her. Commander Thress did not step back. He went very still, which I would learn was the specific stillness of a Vethari commander doing rapid threat assessment with no visible tells whatsoever. He was looking at Biscuit the way he had looked at the house, carefully, completely. Biscuit took one slow step forward, then another, nose still moving. His tail began again, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as his nose told him things his eyes could not. He made a low sound, not aggression, the particular not growl of a dog who is deeply interested in something and has not yet decided what to do about it. It is assessing us, Thress said, very level. He is saying hello, I said. Biscuit, come here. Biscuit did not come here. He walked with great purpose directly to Commander Thress and pressed his nose firmly against the commander's hand. Thress looked down at him. Biscuit looked up at Thress. It was, I realized, the first time I had seen the commander look at anything with an expression that could be described as uncertain. What is the classification of this creature? He asked. Golden retriever, I said. A domestic dog. A pet. He has been with the family since he was 8 weeks old and is currently 7 years old, and deeply convinced that everyone he meets has been waiting their whole life to pet him. A domestic animal, Yalith said. Correct. She looked at Biscuit. Biscuit looked at her with the brown-eyed patience of a creature who has an infinite amount of time for this particular game and knows how it ends. Then he walked over to her and pressed the top of his head against her hand in the way he did with everyone, because Biscuit did not consider this a request. He considered it a reminder. Yalith looked at her hand. She looked at Biscuit. She looked at me. It initiated physical contact, she said. He likes you, I said. He does that to everyone. It is not personal, except that it is entirely personal. He genuinely likes everyone. There was a pause during which I watched second-in-command Yalith of the Vethari warrior caste, veteran of more conflict than I could calculate, stand in a Texas driveway and process the fact that a golden retriever had leaned its head against her hand and was now sitting in the dirt and waiting, with the deep patience of a very good dog, for her to understand what was expected of her. She reached down, slowly and deliberately, and touched the top of his head with 2 fingers. Biscuit's tail reached maximum operating speed. She straightened up and turned to Thress and said something in Vethari, her voice low and quick. Whatever it was, Thress responded with a question. She said something more. He looked back at Biscuit, who had turned his attention to the next nearest warrior and was beginning the same approach procedure. This animal, Thress said, to me. It lives inside the dwelling. Yes, sir. He sleeps in my daughter's room when she visits. He has a bed in the kitchen as well, but he prefers the couch. Another pause, longer this time. Inside, he said again. The single word arrived with a weight that suggested it was doing a lot of work. Yes, sir. He looked at the other 5 warriors. Something passed between them in the way of people who know each other well enough to communicate without speaking. Then he straightened, clasped his hands behind his back with the posture of command, and walked toward the front door. I found out 3 days later, from a compact cultural attaché, who had a bureaucratic obligation to transparency and an evident appreciation for the strange, that a standard Vethari threat assessment protocol required mandatory reclassification of any dwelling found to contain a voluntary apex-capable predator animal in a cohabitation arrangement. The protocol threshold was based on body mass relative to average occupant mass, predator instinct rating, and demonstrated territorial behavior. Biscuit, at 70 pounds, with his charging through the screen door entrance velocity and his immediate advancement towards 6 unknown beings, had cleared the lower threshold of what the Vethari protocol database categorized as an integrated biosecurity measure. He had been in the family's database for less than 4 minutes. I am enormously proud of him for that. My mother was in the kitchen when we came through the front door. She was standing at the counter with a jar of jalapenos in one hand and a pair of canning tongs in the other, wearing a yellow apron that said something cheerful across the front, and had a small burn mark near the pocket from a cooking incident several years ago that she had never fully explained. She was in the middle of a canning operation that had clearly been going on for some time, based on the number of jars lined up on the counter and the particular focused expression of a person who is in the productive part of a project. She turned when she heard the door, saw me, saw the 6-7-foot pale blue beings filing through her living room, and said, "Oh good, you are all here. Marcus, did everyone find the place all right? I was starting to think the gate was stuck." Her name is Carol Reyes. She raised me and my 2 sisters in this house. She drove a cattle truck in her 20s. She once chased a bobcat off the back porch with a broom at 2 in the morning and went back to bed and was asleep in 10 minutes. She had worked as a substitute teacher, a tax preparer, and a part-time veterinary assistant at various points across 40 years of busy life, and she had never once, in any of it, lost her composure for more than the time it took her to identify what needed to be done next. "Mom," I said, "this is the Vethari delegation. Commander Thress. This is my mother, Carol Reyes." "Very glad to meet you," my mother said, with the warmth of a woman who meant it. "I have been looking forward to it. I hope the drive was not too bad. Come and sit, I will get drinks out. Marcus, tell them to make themselves at home. There is plenty of room." Commander Thress looked at her. He looked at the jars lined up on the counter, 12 of them, lids set out beside them with the organized logic of a production process. He looked at the gas stove behind her where a blue flame was burning under a large pot that smelled wonderful, and at the steam coming steadily from the pot, and at the window above the sink where the afternoon light came through, and lit the whole kitchen in that warm way that kitchens get lit in the late afternoon. He looked at the knife block beside the stove, 8 knives in it of different sizes and purposes, and the kitchen shears hanging from a hook on the wall above it, and a meat tenderizer sitting on the corner of the counter, with the unconcerned air of a tool that had been set down briefly and had simply not been picked up again. He looked at the calendar on the refrigerator, and the small ceramic rooster on the windowsill, and the row of potted herbs on the sill beside it. Then he looked at my mother, who was looking at him with friendly expectation. "Carol Reyes," he said, through the translator, giving the name the careful pronunciation of someone making sure they have it exactly right. "You are the primary occupant of this installation. This is my home." "Yes," she said. 40 years come November. "You live here alone?" "My husband visits most weeks. He is in the garage right now." "Earl," she called, not very loudly, in the direction of the back door. "Marcus is here with his people." My father's voice came from somewhere beyond the back wall, muffled by distance and one solid wall. "Be right in, just finishing up." My mother turned back to her jalapenos and resumed placing them into a jar with the methodical contentment of someone who genuinely enjoys this work. She was humming something faintly, not performing contentment, actually feeling it. I watched Yelith take a slow and thorough inventory of the kitchen. Later she would ask me to explain the open flame stove, not in a hostile way, in the genuinely puzzled way of someone who wants to understand a choice. She said her people cooked food also. She understood the application of heat to organic matter. What she did not understand was the uncontained nature of the flame. Why, she asked, was the fire not enclosed behind a barrier? I explained about heat distribution and temperature control, and the difference between radiant heat and convective heat, and how most of our best cooking methods had been developed over thousands of years by people who were very serious about food. She listened to all of this carefully. Then she asked if we had ever considered containing the flame behind a transparent barrier that would allow heat transmission while reducing the open fire risk. I told her about glass-top stoves. She found this interesting but continued to look at the open flame burners with the expression of someone who has accepted a thing without quite understanding it. The knife block came up later, and I will get to that. What mattered in those first minutes was the way the 6 Vethari moved through the house. Courteous, quiet, careful. They touched nothing without asking. They asked before they sat, and stood when they were uncertain whether sitting was appropriate. They were exactly as disciplined and precise as the briefing documents had described. But they watched everything. Thress would look at a wall, and his gaze would track from corner to corner with the slow thoroughness of a structural inspection. Yalith moved from window to window in the living room, not standing in front of each one for long, just pausing long enough to note the latch mechanism and the glass thickness and the window frame. One of the other warriors, a younger male whose name translated to something close to Solon, crouched down in the hallway near the back of the house and looked at the floor. Just the floor. The hardwood planks, the way they were fitted and finished, the baseboard joint. "What are you looking for?" I asked him. He looked up with the expression of a junior soldier caught doing something he cannot easily explain. "The interface between the structure and the substructure," he said. I was attempting to estimate the anchor depth. "The foundation," I said. "Concrete slab, about 4 feet deep. The land floods sometimes during heavy rain, so the original builder went down deep." He stood up. He looked at the floor again, then at the ceiling. His expression was the specific expression of someone who is revising an estimate upward. 4 feet, he said. "Roughly, yes. On standard civilian construction. On all construction around here," I said. "It is just how you build in this terrain if you want the building to still be there in 50 years. He nodded slowly and followed the others into the living room, and I had the distinct sense that something in his internal model of this situation had just shifted. My father came in from the garage just before dinner, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Earl Reyes was 63, built with the solidity of a man who had spent his working life doing physical work, and had not stopped just because he was old enough to. He had been a soldier and then a builder, and you could see both of those things in him if you knew what to look for. He came through the back door and he saw the Vethari standing in his living room, and he did not stop moving or change his expression beyond a mild widening of interest. And he walked over to Commander Thress and put out his hand. "Earl Reyes," he said. "Glad you could make it. Long trip for you." Thress shook his hand. He shook it with the same directness my father offered it. "Commander Thress," he said, through the translator. "The journey was comfortable. Thank you." "Good," my father said. He looked at Thress with the frank assessment of a man who had spent a lot of years evaluating people quickly, and had gotten good at it. "You hungry? Carol has been cooking since before noon." "We will eat," Thress said. "Good," my father said again, and went to wash his hands. I found out considerably later, reading through translated cultural materials, that a compact liaison officer sent me after the summit, that among the Vethari, extending an open hand to someone you have just met is a gesture of status equivalence. It is done between people of similar rank. A junior officer does not initiate it with a senior one. A civilian, by compact convention, would not initiate it with a military commander at all. My father had walked in from his garage and offered a handshake to the most senior Vethari military officer on Earth, as if they were two people meeting at a hardware store. Thress had accepted it. I think, looking back through everything that came afterward, that this moment was where something fundamental began to shift in how Commander Thress understood us. Not the house, not the dog, not the knife block or the flaming stove. The handshake from a retired soldier who wiped his hands on a shop rag before introductions because his mother had raised him right, and who looked a 7-foot alien military commander in the 4 eyes and said, effectively, "Hello, I hear you are visiting. Are you hungry?" The peer-to-peer assumption was so complete and so natural that it was not even a performance. My father did not know he was doing anything unusual. To him, there was a guest in his house. You greeted guests. That was the end of the analysis. Thress did not say anything about it. He went to the table and sat where my mother directed him, and looked at the bowl of chili she placed in front of him with the focused calm of a man examining something important. But I watched his face, and I saw the adjustment happening. The kitchen table seated 8, if everyone was willing to be friendly about it, and my family had always been friendly about it. We crowded in around the oval wooden table that had been in that kitchen since before I was born, my parents at each end, me along one side, and the 6 Vethari arranged across both sides with the careful precision of people who have assessed the seating geometry and chosen positions accordingly. Thress sat directly across from my father, which I suspected was not an accident. My mother had set out water and iced tea, because that was what she set out at every meal without thinking about it. The Vethari looked at the iced tea with curiosity. Thress picked up his glass, held it, observed the condensation forming on the outside, smelled the contents carefully, and set it back down. He picked up the water instead. The others followed his lead. The chili went around. My mother had made it the way she always made it, which is to say she had cooked it since morning, and it was deep and rich and smoky, and exactly as spicy as she thought it should be, which was considerably spicier than most people thought was reasonable. She had also, in the final 20 minutes, added the contents of a small jar from the back of her cabinet. The jar had no label. I had never asked what was in it. The results spoke for themselves, or rather the results spoke loudly, and in several directions at once. The smell off that pot was extraordinary. The kind of smell that means someone has been doing something right for a very long time. I watched Thress look at his bowl. He had a small device at his collar that I knew from the briefing was a basic environmental scanner. It checked air quality, chemical composition of nearby materials, presence of biological agents. He glanced at its readout. Whatever it told him, he picked up his spoon. The Vethari, according to the diplomatic health documentation, had a flexible digestive biology. They could eat a range of foods that many compact species could not manage. Chili had been cleared as safe for consumption. The health team had done their due diligence. What they had not fully accounted for was what my mother specifically did with chili. Thress took one bite. He was still for a moment in the way he was still when processing something unexpected. He swallowed. He reached for his water and drank from it in a single controlled motion. He set the glass down. He looked at my mother. "This is a standard preparation of this food," he said. "Family recipe," she said, pleased. "I have made it this way since before Marcus was born. Do you like it?" He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. "It contains a significant chemical irritant compound," he said. "The jalapenos," she said, "and a few other things. You get used to it quickly. Marcus, eat your food." I ate. I had eaten this chili my entire life. The heat did not register for me anymore. I could not tell you whether this represented physiological adaptation, psychological resignation, or straightforward nerve damage, and I had genuinely stopped caring which it was. Yelith was sitting to my left. She had taken 2 measured bites, each one careful and deliberate, and was now sitting very straight with her temperature-sensing nostrils flared slightly. She reached for her water. "The compound," she said to me quietly. "It creates this sensation deliberately." "Yes," I said. "People enjoy the warmth. It is part of the flavor experience. You eat it for enjoyment. Many people do, yes. It is very popular." She looked at her bowl for a moment. Then she took another bite. A full bite, not a small one. The deliberate bite of someone who has decided that this bowl of chili is not going to win. I have a profound respect for that kind of stubbornness. I always have. Solon, across the table, had started talking with my father about the property. Not about anything that had come up in a briefing or an agenda. The way people talk when they are actually curious about something. My father was explaining the dry creek in the back acreage, how it ran hard for a day or two after real rain and was bone dry the rest of the year, and how you had to know where the crossing points were, or you could lose a truck tire in the mud at the wrong season. Solon was asking questions. Small, precise questions. What kind of substrate in the creek bed? How deep the mud got? Whether the water table showed above ground anywhere else on the property. My father answered all of it with the patience of a man who likes talking about his land and has never been asked these particular questions before, and finds them interesting. I was watching this across the table and I knew, on some level, what I was watching, but it was such a pleasant dinner, and Solon was so genuinely engaged, and my father was so cheerfully informative, that I could not make myself interrupt it. The meal took about an hour. By the end of it, The chili was mostly finished. The iced tea had been tried with varying degrees of adventurousness, and my mother had produced a peach pie from the oven. She set it on the table with the quiet confidence of a woman who knows exactly what she has made and does not need anyone to tell her. The pie was from the tree in the backyard that her own mother had planted and that had been producing reliable peaches every summer for 30 years. She had made the crust from scratch that morning while we were driving to Fort Haverfield to pick up the delegation. Thress looked at the pie. "Another prepared food item," he said. "Peach pie," my mother said. "From our own tree, 30 years old. That tree." She cut him a slice and set it in front of him with the decisive cheerfulness of a person who has decided everyone is going to eat the pie. He picked up his fork. He ate a bite of the pie. There was a pause. A genuine, full pause, of a kind I had not seen from him yet. "This," he said, "is very good." The translator rendered it with precision, and the precision somehow carried something that sounded like honest surprise. My mother smiled with the contentment of a woman who has made a good thing and had it acknowledged. "I will send some home with you," she said. "I put up preserves every year. I have extra." Commander Thress looked at her across the table. "That would be acceptable," he said. And that was the moment when I understood something important. Not about the house, not about the report that was coming, not about the treaty terms or the diplomatic consequences. Something smaller and more human than any of that. This man had walked through worlds I could not imagine. He had made decisions that ended wars. He sat at the head of the most feared military delegation in the compact, and he carried a scar that had not stopped him from doing any of it. And he was sitting in my mother's kitchen, eating peach pie, and he meant it when he said it was very good. There are moments that you know, even as they are happening, that you will remember them forever. This was one of those moments, not because of what it meant for humanity, though it meant a great deal, because of what it meant in that kitchen, at that table, with those particular people, in that particular evening light. I ate my pie. It was excellent. It always was. My father went to bed early, as he always did, and my mother cleaned the kitchen with the efficient warmth of someone who has been feeding people all her life and finds the cleanup part as satisfying as the cooking. The Vethari helped without being asked, which I thought was interesting. Yelith collected plates from the table with the calm directness of someone who has been a guest in many places and understands that helping is a form of respect. Solon found the dish rack on the first try, which meant he had noted its location during dinner, which was either efficient or slightly unsettling, and I decided to consider it efficient. Thress, who I sensed might have found the actual washing of dishes to be in tension with his dignity, held the cabinet doors open while my mother put things away, because he had observed that the high shelves required her to reach up and he was tall enough to make that unnecessary. She thanked him the same way she would have thanked anyone, warmly, briefly, and then moved on to the next task. I showed the delegation to their rooms. The house had 3 bedrooms and my father had set up camp cots from the garage to supplement, so everyone had a place. It was not luxury. It was a house, being used as a house, which is all it had ever needed to be. Thress stood in the doorway of the main guest room and looked at it, the wooden bed frame, the quilt that had been made by my grandmother in 1981 and had been washed perhaps 200 times since and was worn soft in the way of things that have been well used and well kept, the window looking out over the dark scrub, with the latch on the inside, and the curtains my mother had made from fabric she bought at a sale in town. "You have stayed in this room," Thress said. It was not entirely a question. "Many times," I said. "It was my aunt's room when she visited. She passed away 9 years ago." He looked at the quilt, the textile on the bed. "My grandmother made it. She has been gone about 20 years. He was quiet for a moment. "It is kept," he said. "Yes," I said. "My mother keeps it clean. It is a good quilt." He looked at it for another moment, and his expression was something I did not have a name for, not quite recognition, something adjacent to it. Then, the perimeter. There is no external monitoring. My father walks the fence line most mornings. A pause. "By himself," Thress said. "Yes, sir." He looked out the window into the dark. The night was full in the way that rural nights in Texas are full, not silent but quiet, with the sound of natural things going about natural business in the dark. A cricket somewhere close, wind in the cedar, and then, from some distance south, a coyote, Not close. Just present. Doing what coyotes do in the dark when they think no one is listening. What was that sound? Thress said. Coyote, I said. Wild canine, native to this region. They are throughout this area. They do not bother people. He looked at me. There are wild predator animals in proximity to this dwelling, he said. Sure, I said. Coyotes, bobcats on occasion, mountain lions in the hills further south, though we have not had one come close in a few years. There was a black bear sighting about 30 miles from here last spring. None of them are a concern. He was quiet. The coyote called again, closer this time, then faded. Your parents live here, he said slowly. 2 people. No external monitoring system. In range of multiple wild predator species. They have lived here 40 years, I said. My mother gardens. My father fixes things. They are very happy here. He looked at the window. He looked at the quilt. He looked at me, and his expression was one I was beginning to recognize as the expression he used when he was working through something that did not fit neatly into any framework he had built. Liaison Reyes, he said. I have a question. Go ahead, sir. He was quiet for a moment before he asked it, which I understood now meant the question mattered. How do your people sleep? He said. In structures like this. I thought about it. He deserved an honest answer. Pretty well, I said. Usually. He held my eyes for a moment. Then he said, quietly and precisely, that is what concerns me. He said good night, and went into the room and closed the door, and I stood in the hallway for a moment, with the sound of the coyote fading in the dark, and the cricket going, and I turned that sentence over, and tried to understand it. It took me until close to midnight, lying on a cot with Biscuit's weight on my feet, to get there. He was not frightened. Not of the house, not of the dark, not of the coyotes or the absence of a monitoring system. This was a man who had stood in the wreckage of wars and had not been frightened, not in any way that reached his face or changed his decision-making. He was not the kind of person who felt fear the way most people feel it, and even if he had been, nothing in my parents' house was going to frighten him. What he had meant was something different. He had walked through this house and sat at this table, and watched my father shake his hand like they were equals, and my mother offer him pie like she would offer it to anyone, and the dog charge through the door at full speed, and then sit patiently at Yelith's feet for an entire meal, and he had looked at the limestone walls and the steel door, and the deep foundation, and the knives in the kitchen, and the 2 people who had lived here for 40 years, among wild animals and weather, and everything else that South Texas could produce, without alarm and without ceremony, as if this were simply life. Because for them, it was simply life. And he was one of the most experienced military minds in known space, and he had looked at our ordinary life, and seen something in it that we had never needed to articulate, because we had never had occasion to. We had just been living it. I lay in the dark with Biscuit's chin on my ankle, and I thought about what he had said, and I thought about the house and my parents and my grandfather who had helped lay the stone and my father who had driven the trucks, and my sister who had repainted the walls, and I thought about all the things we built and how we built them and why, and I understood for the first time, really understood, that there was no separation between those things in us. There had never been a separation. We did not build our houses to look strong. We built them to be strong, because that is what you did if you were going to live in a place and raise children there, and stay for 40 years. We did not put our knives in a kitchen because we were prepared for something. We put our knives in a kitchen because that is where knives were useful for cooking. We did not raise soldiers because we were a warlike people. We raised soldiers because every generation had found itself in a world that needed them, and so you went. The house was not a fortification. It just looked that way from the outside, if the outside you were coming from had never needed to build things quite that way. The coyote was quiet. The cricket was still going. Biscuit shifted, sighed, and settled deeper against my feet. I closed my eyes and slept fine, as I generally do. I was awake at 5:40 because Biscuit stood up and shook himself, and when Biscuit shakes himself at 5:40 in the morning, it is not a subtle event. He walked to the kitchen and pushed his bowl against the baseboard until it rang out, which was his version of a detailed explanation, and I got up and fed him. While I was doing that, I noticed that the back porch light was on. I poured 2 cups of coffee and went outside. Commander Thress was standing at the far edge of the porch, looking out over the property in the early light. His posture was the posture of command, straight and settled, arms at his sides. His 4 eyes were moving across the landscape in that slow, layered tracking motion. I walked over and held out one of the cups. He looked at it. "You do not have to offer," he said. "Something to hold," I said. "Early morning. It helps." He took the cup. He held it. He did not drink it. We stood there together while the sky went from dark blue to pale, and the birds began waking up in the cedar, and the heat began building at the edges of things. The scrub stretched out flat and gray-green and still, and here and there a rock outcropping caught the first light and went gold. "Your father built this structure," Thress said, after a while. "No," I said. "A man named Gerald built it in 1972. My parents bought it in 1984. But your father maintains it. He does most of the work, yes. I have helped over the years. My sister repainted the exterior about 3 years ago. My brother-in-law reran the electrical on the east side last summer." He nodded slowly. "Then, your family is not unusual by your species standards." "No, sir. Very ordinary family." "Your grandfather served in a military conflict," he said. I looked at him. I had not mentioned my grandfather. Not at dinner, not at any point during the evening. "Korea," I said. 1950. Your father served. 2 tours, Army Corps of Engineers. Yourself. 11 years, 2 deployments. Yes, sir. Your sister. 6 years in your naval branch. That is correct. And a cousin. Afghanistan. 2 deployments. Yes. I looked at him directly. You ran a record search. Yalith submitted a background inquiry to the Compact's Diplomatic Intelligence Division after we arrived, he said. The information was available in your public record systems. We accessed nothing that was not already open. Public records, I said. Yes. I thought about that for a moment. What are you taking from it? He turned to look at the house. He looked at it with the full attention he brought to everything, the limestone in the early light, the steel roof, the deep-set windows, the garden along the south wall starting to become visible as the light grew. I am taking from it, he said, that your species produces soldiers from ordinary households, across multiple generations, as a matter of custom, not as a crisis response, not as a dedicated caste function, as a thing that simply happens, generation to generation, in families that are otherwise indistinguishable from non-military families. I said nothing to that. I am also taking from it, he continued, that the physical dwelling of such a family is constructed to the same standard as the dwelling of a family with no military history. The construction does not reflect the occupants, it reflects the environment. We build for what the weather does, I said, and for what lasts. Yes, he said, that is what I mean. He was quiet again. The hawk from the day before, or one very like it, appeared over the scrub to the east and began circling. In the compact, he said, after a while, there is a clear delineation between the civilian population and the military population. Different training tracks, different communities, different physical infrastructure. The garrison looks different from the town. You can tell, from looking, which is which. I know, I said. I read the briefing materials. Your garrison, he said, does not look different from the town. I looked at my parents' house in the morning light. No, I said. I suppose it does not. This is not a failure of your military to build sufficient facilities, he said. I want to be precise. I mean that the house of your retired parents in a rural area of your country, built by a private citizen in 1972, meets the structural threshold for a defensive installation by compact classification standards. 18-inch load-bearing stone walls, reinforced concrete foundation, steel core door with redundant locking mechanisms, double-glazed apertures, independent power source. He paused, and a resident animal classified at Tier 4 predator threshold. I looked at him. Biscuit, I said. Yes. I did not say anything for a moment. Then, Gerald built it because stone was cheap and local and lasts. My mother added the bar lock because a coyote opened the door one night. My father put the propane tank in concrete because it was safer. The double windows are because of the heat. All of it has a practical reason. Yes, Thress said. That is the point. Every element has a practical reason. and the accumulation of practical reasons produces something that, from the outside, appears to be a fortified position maintained by a retired couple who keep a large predator animal indoors and live contentedly in range of multiple wild apex species. He looked at me. "This is ordinary," he said. "You have indicated it is ordinary. I have reviewed your public records and I believe you. This is not a selected example. This is simply how your people live." I looked at the house. I looked at the garden, where my mother's tomatoes were coming up along the south wall. I looked at the old wind chime my sister had made hanging from the porch eave. "We just live here," I said. "Yes," Thress said. "That is what I mean." He handed me back the coffee cup, still full. He straightened his uniform. "We should prepare to leave for the summit," he said. "There is work to be done today." He went back inside, and I stood on the porch for another moment with 2 cups of coffee, watching the hawk drift south, thinking about the gap between how we see ourselves and how we look from somewhere else in the universe. Then I went in, and my mother made eggs, and we ate breakfast at the crowded table, and Biscuit sat at Yalith's feet the entire meal, with his chin on her boot, and she let him, and nobody mentioned any of the things we had said on the porch. But as we loaded the car, I noticed Thress look back at the house one final time. Not a long look, brief and complete and very quiet. The look of a man who is filing something away in a place where it will not be lost. We drove to the summit, and the morning opened up wide and bright ahead of us, and whatever had been figured out in the night had settled somewhere in all of us, and the drive back was not like the drive in. Something had changed. I could feel it in the car, in the silence that was different from the first silence, in the way Thress sat and looked at the road ahead with an expression that had shifted slightly from the expression he had worn coming in. I did not know what it meant yet for the days ahead. I was about to find out. The summit ran for 2 full days in the main conference facility at Fort Haverfield, and I will be honest and say that treaty language at this level was not my area of deep expertise. I had been briefed on the framework, and I understood the general shape of what was being negotiated, which was a set of mutual recognition agreements and cooperative protocols that would define the relationship between humanity and the compact going forward for a significant period. The details were handled by people who had trained for years in precisely this discipline. My job was to keep things running smoothly and answer cultural questions and make sure nobody accidentally caused offense through misunderstanding. I was good at that job. I paid attention to people. I noticed things. What I noticed over those 2 days, Thress was completely focused, precise, and very good at what he did. He said what he meant, asked for what he wanted, was clear about what was not acceptable, and listened genuinely when the other side explained their position. The sessions moved forward because he moved them forward, and the human negotiating team matched him, and the back and forth had the quality of 2 groups of serious people who have decided to get somewhere. But in the margins, in the breaks and the meals and the corridors between sessions, I kept noticing things. Yalith, during a morning break on the first day, in conversation with one of our civilian agricultural liaison staff, not about the treaty, about building construction, how Americans decided where to build a house, what the standards were, what the inspection process looked like, what happened when structures were damaged by weather. The liaison staff person answered thoroughly, as she answered everything, and Yalith listened with the same focused attention she had given to my parents' windows. I watched this from across the room, and I did not interrupt it. Solon, at lunch on the first day, had found his way to a conversation with a facilities engineer from the base about water tables in limestone terrain and how underground aquifers affected foundation choices. This conversation went considerably longer than the meal. Solon asked questions that were more specific than the engineer had expected, and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. The engineer, who was the kind of person who is always pleased when someone is genuinely interested in foundations, expanded enthusiastically. My father had started that chain. At the dinner table, answering questions about the back paddock, he had provided a detailed terrain analysis of approximately 40 acres of South Texas land to a Vethari military intelligence officer who was listening to it as landscape assessment over peach pie. My father did not know this. He just liked talking about his land. On the morning of the second day, Thress asked our chief negotiator, directly and without preamble, what percentage of the human population had served in some military capacity. The question landed in a slight pause in the discussion, like a stone in still water. The negotiator, who was a steady and experienced woman named Dr. Patricia Glover, answered it without visible surprise. She gave the current veteran population figure, the historical service rates, and the reserve and auxiliary figures, all from memory, because she was that kind of person. Thress did not write anything down. He never wrote anything down. He nodded once and returned to the agenda item they had been on. The second afternoon session ended earlier than planned, which had not been the case in any of the previous planning documents. I was in the corridor when Dr. Glover came out, and she had an expression on her face that I recognized as controlled satisfaction, which was as close to open emotion as she ever got. "How did it go?" I asked. "Well," she said, and then after a moment, "better than the framework suggested." She did not say more than that, because she was not a person who said more than was necessary. But I watched her walk down the corridor with the particular energy of someone who has just come out of a room where something went better than expected, and I filed it away. That evening, after the delegation had retired, I was sitting in the debrief lounge writing my own report when the compact cultural attaché, a small efficient being named Prayton, appeared at my elbow. She had an air of a person who has been waiting for the right moment and has identified it. "Liaison Reyes," she said, "if you have a few minutes." I followed her to a side room that was being used as a quiet workspace. She set a tablet on the table in front of me. On the screen was a document in compact diplomatic format, already translated into English, with several sections rendered in gray to indicate redaction. "Commander Thress submitted a mandatory threat reassessment report following the pre-summit site visit to your family's residential property," she said. "It is protocol for field officers to submit such reports when a site visit produces information that materially affects existing intelligence classifications. I am sharing a translated summary with you as a matter of diplomatic transparency, because the conclusions of the report have direct implications for how the compact will engage with your species, and your diplomatic team should understand the basis for certain adjustments that were made to the compact's negotiating position in this summit." I looked at the document. I read it. Then I read it again. The top portion was redacted. Several paragraphs in the middle were redacted. A section in the third quarter was redacted. What remained was organized around the standard compact military assessment structure, with headers and numbered rating categories, most of which I did not have context to interpret. But the conclusion section was intact. It read, in the formal and exact language of compact military intelligence documentation, preliminary threat classification of Homo sapiens as a Category B emerging species, with military capacity concentrated in formal defense structures and a clearly delineated civilian-military boundary, is assessed as fundamentally inaccurate and requires immediate revision. Site assessment of standard civilian residential structure, occupied by 2 non-active adult humans of retirement age, with no current formal military affiliation, produced the following observations. 1. Structural construction materials and methods consistent with low to mid-level defensive fortification by compact standards. 2. Integration of multiple edged implements and impact tools within the standard domestic living space in immediate access configuration. 3. Voluntary cohabitation with a domesticated animal, meeting the threshold for compact Tier 4 predator classification, based on mass, territorial behavior indicators, and demonstrated approach without threat posture toward unknown individuals. 4. Residential proximity to multiple wild apex category predator territories, with no defensive countermeasures deployed, and no apparent behavioral concern demonstrated by occupants. 5. Documentation of 3-generation military service pattern within a single family unit described by the assigned human liaison officer as ordinary. The next paragraph. Standard compact methodology for distinguishing civilian from military population in target or allied species assumes a structural and behavioral separation between the two groups. This methodology cannot be applied to Homo sapiens. The civilian population at large appears to maintain baseline environmental adaptation, structural defensive practice, and multi-generational service patterns that do not degrade in the absence of formal military enrollment. The physical residential environment reflects accumulated optimization across generations of occupants. There is no observable break between the defensive practices of the non-military family and those of a military family, because both are products of the same environment and the same inherited practices. And then the final section, The one that I kept returning to. It is the assessment of this officer that Category B classification represents a strategic misunderstanding of significant and potentially critical consequence. Recommend immediate upward revision of threat classification across all tiers. Recommend further that all compact member states receive a revised briefing indicating that what humans designate as a civilian population and what humans designate as a military population may, in operational practice, describe the same individuals at different points in the same life. I set the tablet down. I looked at the wall for a moment, because I needed a moment. He wrote this, I said, after one evening at my parents' house. Yes, Prayton said, because of the limestone and the knife block and the dog. And the foundation depth, she said, and the door mechanism, and the family service history, and several other items that appear in the redacted sections. She paused. The dietary capsaicin tolerance of your species appears in one redacted section. I mention this only because it was listed as a separate data point from the food preparation methods. I thought about Yalith eating the chili, with her nostrils flared, and her back straight, and her jaw set. And the other redacted sections? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. One section pertains to the large domestic animal, she said. Biscuit, I said. Yes, she said. The classification level of that section is higher than the rest of the document. I looked at her. She looked back at me with the expression of a professional who has made peace with the fact that her job occasionally produces situations that defy easy categorization. A section of a classified compact military intelligence report, I said slowly, about my parents' golden retriever, is classified at a higher level than the rest of the report about my parents' house being assessed as a fortified installation. Yes, she said. I was quiet for a moment. The summit terms, I said. You said adjustments were made. The second morning session ran considerably longer than scheduled, she said. Several of the initial compact positions were revised during that session. The final treaty terms as agreed upon are materially more favorable to your species than the framework document had suggested they would be. Because of the threat reassessment. I cannot speak to the specific reasoning of Commander Thress, she said, in the precise way of a professional who knows exactly where the line is. I can tell you that the report was filed the morning of the first summit day, and that the session adjustments occurred on the second day. I thought about Thress on the back porch in the early light, holding a cup of coffee he never drank, looking at an ordinary house, and telling me that it was what concerned him. I thought about him understanding, from one evening in a kitchen and one night in a stone house and one morning watching the sun come up over the scrub, something about us that we had never needed to say aloud, something that we had simply always been. We build things to last, all of our things, not because we plan for war, because we live in a world that does not go easy, and we have always lived in a world that does not go easy, and you build accordingly when that is the world you have. I called my mother that evening. She answered on the second ring. How is it going? She asked. Well, I said. The summit went well. Very well, actually. You helped. Oh, I didn't do anything, she said. Mom, I said, you made chili. In a kitchen that a Vethari military commander assessed as a tactical installation. The report is partially classified and at least one section of it is about your dog. A pause. Biscuit? She said. Yes. What did they say about Biscuit? I don't know, I said. That section is at the highest classification level. Another pause. Well, she said, he is a very good dog. He is, I said. Mom, you also inadvertently helped renegotiate humanity's position in the galactic community. Oh, she said, that is nice. Did those tall blue boys get enough to eat though? The one who sat across from your father, I don't think he finished his chili. I should have sent more home with them. I thought about Commander Thress of the Vethari warrior caste, veteran of 14 interplanetary conflicts, sitting somewhere in a compact vessel with a container of my mother's peach preserves. I think they were fed, I said. I should have sent more, she said again, with the conviction of a woman who has never once believed that there was enough food sent with anyone. I said goodnight and went to the departure pad, and I shook hands with each of the delegation in turn as the shuttle prepared to lift. Solon, who had learned the water table depth of my parents' back 40 during dinner. The others, who had catalogued the windows and measured the walls with their eyes, and noted everything. Yalith, who had let Biscuit rest his chin on her boot for an entire breakfast without asking him to move, and who gave me a nod that carried more weight than most words I had been handed that week. And Thress. He shook my hand the way my father had shaken his. Directly, without ceremony, one person to another. Liaison Reyes, he said. Commander. He held my eyes for a moment. Thank your mother, he said. The food was exceptional. The hospitality was notable. I will tell her, I said. She will be pleased. I am sure she will be, he said. And then, after a brief pause, in the level tone of a man saying something he has considered carefully and has decided to say plainly, your people are difficult to classify. We have heard that before, I said. The edge of his expression moved in a way I had come to recognize as the Vethari equivalent of a dry acknowledgement. I imagine you will continue to hear it, he said. He turned and went up the ramp. The delegation followed, the door closed. The shuttle lifted in that smooth, noiseless way, rising straight up without drama, and disappeared into the blue Texas sky. I stood on the pad for a moment in the heat and the light and the open space of it. Then I got in the Ford Expedition, with the dent in the bumper and the cracked windshield, and drove back toward the fort, and I wrote up my report, and I submitted it, and Colonel Briggs called me back in under 30 minutes. Reyes, he said. Sir, did your mother's house end up in a classified compact intelligence document? Yes, sir. And the dog? Yes, sir. The dog section is classified at a higher level than the house section. There was a silence that I enjoyed very much. Carry on, he said, and hung up. I sat in the parking lot for a minute longer after that call. The heat was building fast, the way it does in Texas in June, and the asphalt around the car was starting to shimmer at the edges. I thought about Thress on the back porch in the early morning. I thought about what he had said about us, that we could not be classified using standard methodology, because the civilian population and the military population were the same population at different points in the same life, that our houses and our fortifications were not separate things, because they never had been, that we built for what the world could do to us, and in doing so had produced something that looked from the outside like intentional defense, when from the inside it was just Tuesday. I have been a soldier for 11 years. I have spent those years learning how to assess things, how to read a situation, how to understand structure and intention and threat and safety. I was trained for it, and I was good at it, and I had thought I understood myself and my people fairly well as a result. What Commander Thress had given me, from one evening at my parents' kitchen table, and one morning on a back porch watching the sun come up, was a view of us from far enough outside to see the whole shape of it. We are a species that evolved on the most punishing habitable planet in known space. We have been living with things that could kill us every day of our history on this earth, and we have responded not by becoming afraid, but by becoming prepared, in a way so deep and so old that we no longer see it as preparation. It is just how we live. The stone walls and the steel doors and the deep foundations, the knives in the kitchen and the wild animals in the dark, and the dog that charges through doors, and the two old people who have lived here 40 years and have no intention of leaving, the grandfathers and the fathers and the children who go and come back and go again. We do not divide those things into categories. We never needed to. We are all of it at once, all the time, and we do not notice it because we have never known anything else. Commander Thress noticed it because he had come from somewhere else. And from somewhere else, it looked like something remarkable. I started the car. I drove back to the fort. I filed my paperwork and went home to my apartment and called my daughter, who was 7, and was staying with her grandparents that week, and she told me about the peaches she had picked from the tree in the backyard that afternoon, and about Biscuit sleeping on the new patch of sun that came through the kitchen window in the mornings. I told her I would be home in 2 days. She said okay. Then she asked me if the alien people were nice. Very, I said. Were they scared of anything? She asked, with the directness of a 7-year-old who is interested in who is scared of what. I thought about Thress on the porch. I thought about the classified section of the report. Biscuit scared them a little at first, I said. She laughed. It was a very good laugh. Biscuit is not scary, she said. No, I said, but he kind of surprised them. She thought about that for a second. Then, Biscuit surprises everybody, she said. It was said with the certainty of a child who has had a front row seat to this for years. He really does, I said. I said goodnight and hung up, and the apartment was quiet and warm. And I made myself a cup of coffee and sat with it, and did not think about any of the large and significant things for a while. I just sat with the coffee in the quiet, and let the day settle. The report is in a file now. My copy, courtesy of Prayton's diplomatic transparency obligation. I have read it several times. The classified sections remain gray. I do not know and will likely never know exactly what the biscuit section says, or what precise language they used for the knife block in the part that was redacted for brevity. But I think about what the unredacted section said, and I think about Thress looking back at the house as we drove away, and I think about my father and his handshake and my mother and her pie, and I think about Biscuit who does not know that he is in a classified document, and who would not care if he did because he is a golden retriever, and his concerns are simple and sincere, and entirely focused on the present moment. He got a new bed last spring. He ignored it for 3 weeks, and then my mother found him asleep on it one morning, with all 4 feet in the air, which is the highest compliment he gives anything. He is a very good dog. He has always been a very good dog. I sleep fine, usually. And somewhere out in the compact, a veteran of 14 interplanetary conflicts is briefing a room full of admirals about a Category 7 death world where the civilians live in 18-inch stone walls and keep large predator animals in their kitchens and eat chemically irritant food for pleasure and raise soldiers from generation to generation like they are growing something in a garden, and where a 2-person household in a rural area produces, upon inspection, a classified multi-section intelligence document, including 1 section about the family dog. I think about that sometimes. I am proud of all of it, every single part. My mother is still making chili. She says she might adjust the recipe slightly, get the heat a little more even through the batch. I have told her that the current version has already achieved a degree of galactic significance. She said that is very nice, and asked if I wanted some to take home. I said yes. I always say yes. That is just how we are.